somewhere which you don't have to worry. Good. Let me restart that. So this problem is related to remote development. Remote development is essentially where we are trying to move your development environment away from your local machines to something somewhere running in your cloud where you don't have to worry about anything. There's a lot of hand waving in that statement, but that's the gist of it. We recently released a beta version of it somewhere around, I think, May or June. I keep forgetting, where we are only allowing you to create workspaces. Workspace is our term of saying, a developer environment, a workspace for a public project. And right now we are working on enabling that for a private project as well. And this is where we are right now. So we've done a spike on it where everything's working, and we have a spike fully working. The only thing to note over here is we are using personal access tokens scoped to a user. And we are injecting that personal access token into the workspace. So the project is cloned at the start of the workspace. And once you start using the workspace, you can do any operation related to it because it's just a GitLab token. And Git operations automatically work out of the box. I'll share my screen and show you what I mean by that. We've received feedback from quite a few people that we should try to move away from a PAT, primarily because it's a PAT, it's long-lived, you don't want to have a PAT. Can you have something more ephemeral, right? And that's the context. And the benefit of that is obviously additional security. It gives us an opportunity to automatically rotate those credentials every 1 hour, 2 hour, and inject those into the workspace again. So because a workspace, a user can install any software inside a workspace, right? So the security profile is more sensitive over there. There can be any malicious program that is leaking that token somehow. So if we have this way of rotating these secrets every couple of hours, it kind of improves our security profile as well. So that's the context. Before I share my screen and just show you what that looks like, any questions so far?
I have a very basic question about what remote development is, which is like how, in my mind, remote development and the web IDE are like the same thing. How are they different, or what additional information would be helpful to have about remote development?
Yes, so the only difference from a product perspective, we don't want it to be any different from an engineering perspective. Like a product positioning is that, okay, the remote development is sort of an extension of web IDE, but from an engineering perspective, it's different because in the web IDE, you cannot run any commands. Whereas in remote development, you will be able to spin up a terminal, run any commands that you want, and anything you want to do, right? And the web IDE is purely running in the browser as right now, whereas for remote development, it's not running in the browser. It's consuming some resources somewhere in the cloud. We are basically spinning up a Kubernetes cluster, provisioning pods and everything over there, and syncing everything back and everything. So it's consuming some resources somewhere, whereas in web IDE, it's your own local machine and the browser inside of that.
Okay. So yeah, okay, that makes sense.
All right.
That makes a lot of sense.
Any other questions? All right, I'll take that as a no. With that, I'll share my screen. I'll show you what I mean by all of this, right? So I have my GDK running and everything. I have a private project over here. I've cloned the GitLab UI private project and pushed it on my GDK. I create a new workspace I select the project. Before I get into that, let me spend 2 minutes on what this architecture looks like. That will set some context on, okay, this looks scary. It is not, trust me. This essentially is GitLab, multiple components of GitLab, Nginx, Rails, caches, Kubernetes, agent server, Postgres, Gitly. This is our Kubernetes cluster. And we already have a component in GitLab called the GitLab agent for Kubernetes. That is like our way of communicating with Kubernetes. And the reason why we need an agent over there is because, and this agent actually communicates over gRPC. And there's a reason for it is because if the communication was the other way around, from Rails to this agent, we would hit some firewall rules because the network inside a customer's organization is always usually very strict and blocked. Any incoming traffic has more restrictions than any outgoing traffic. So if we have a component residing inside their network and that initiates a conversation, it is much more open. And that is why we have an agent over here which starts the communication over gRPC with CAS. CAS forwards it to Rails. And so let me tell you how this entire thing works, right? When I do this, when I create a workspace, this is the part I'm working over here. I communicate with GitLab Rails. I say, hi, hey, I need a new workspace. It stores it into the Postgres database. And that's the end of that transaction. Now, what happens is after, like at regular intervals, the agent will ping CAS, ping CAS, which will forward it to Rails, asking for information. Hey, do you have any new information for me? And GitLab Rails will be like, hey, this this user has requested a new workspace. These are all the information. Go about and create these Kubernetes resources for this particular workspace. It will receive that information. It will communicate with the Kubernetes API server and create those Kubernetes resources. And once those resources are created, it will, once they are ready, it will echo back its status, and it will echo back its status, which will get persisted in Postgres, which is reflected to us over here, right? So it is just getting ready. Let's just wait for it. Once it is ready, so you can see the status over here, right? It is starting right now. I already have a workspace which is already running.
So just to clarify, you just said we don't make requests from CAS to the agent, but then when you click that button,
yes,
how do we know to spin up a Kubernetes cluster?
Yes. So when I click that button, what happens is Rails just passes that information into Postgres, and that's the end of it. My agent is constantly pinging CAS that, do you have any new information for me, right? That information request is forwarded to, so CAS is like a thin proxy over here. It essentially goes to Rails. Rails then queries the database. Is there any new information? And yes, there is, and it just sends it over to agent. Agent creates those Kubernetes resources. And what it does is it also keeps a watch inside Kubernetes. What has the status of these resources changed? If it has changed, okay, in the next poll that I will initiate, I will also send over that information. So that information then gets updated into the database. And with that, the status of my workspace has changed to running. If I open this URL, it will open up VS Code. The server of this VS Code is injected into the workspace itself. If we within the workspace, a VS Code server is running, and the client as well. And we are just connecting to that over here. And we have a fully working terminal over here, right? Now, this is just the context. We've not even come to the problem. Any questions so far? Okay, I'll leave that as a no. So what happens when this is spun up, right? The first thing that it does is it actually clones the repository. This is the GitLab private repository that gets cloned. And once it gets cloned, the other parts get started. And once it is fully ready, I get a URL. I browse the URL. We have a VS Code server running and accessible from the browser. Because I have my token injected right now, I can just make any changes over here and just use this UI to commit and to push. And it will transparently do that Git operation for me because everything has been configured. I've configured my Git ask pass and everything has been properly configured. And if I look at my project over here, we can see the latest commit, right? So this is what I have working as far as the spike is concerned. Now, this is where the issue that I need some help with, which is this one. Right now, I'm using personal access tokens. I want to explore ways I can remove that dependency. And some of the feedback that we've got is, can we use any form of JWT, right? and I'm sure we can. The thing is, let me say, I am not really a Ruby Rails engineer. So this is where I'm stuck. And authentication and authorization is not my strong suit. So I know it's possible with JWTs. I just don't know how to go about it. I did some digging around the Rails monolith. I found we have a JWT token class, but I could not get it working. And this is what I need help with.
Nice. Okay. And one question I had for you, you're not on the same team as Tan Lee, are you?
Stan Lee.
No, Tan, T-A-N.
No.
Lives in Sydney. Okay. Because there was a feature that I worked on with him, or he really worked on it, and I just looked at it, I should say, around JWTs for code suggestions in the web
Right.
IE. So he had a similar kind of pickle. How do I do authentication? The challenge there was a little bit different. It was less a concern of using a pat not being secure, right? Because it's a long-lived token. It gives you access to more than you probably need for Git operations. In that case, the issue was more they wanted a self-contained token because with the JWT, it contains information about the user and you can add claims, right? So you can have information about which groups this user is a member of and other things like that, which means you can make decisions by just looking at the token about what they can do. Whereas with a PAT, you don't know a PAT's valid until you make the request to GitLab, right? Like you don't know what's been revoked. You don't know. I mean, I guess in theory, you could know that it's going to expire soon, but if somebody revokes it, you don't know that until you make the API request. Whereas JWTs are short-lived, which is, I think, one reason why you're interested in using them for this. And so you just, as long as it's valid, you assume that the information contained within it is the right information.
Yes. And the reason why the JWT is also kind of appealing is because, like you mentioned, you can add some additional metadata to it, right? And let me talk about a utopian future world, right? Where I'll only allow pushes to this Git repository if it is from within that workspaces, right? And I can maybe inject some of that metadata into that JWT, that this JWT should only be valid if the traffic is coming from within a workspace. And this is the workspace ID. Again, there are a lot of moving pieces. There are a lot of things that we would need to do. But the point being, it opens up a lot of possibilities for us, right? And coming to your you mentioned about the code suggestion part, right? I actually checked in with Alpa. I think this probably might be a different one. It's related to suggested reviewers.
Nope, that's the one. See the author? Tan Lee.
Oh yeah, correct. So yeah, the only difference, this is what I when I spoke with Alpa yesterday. So he in fact pointed me to the same MR. The only difference over here is they are doing this as part of, this is not in the Rails monolith, right? This token, the signing of the JWT and everything. The only thing that's in the Rails monolith is the verification of this token, this endpoint. And what I want is basically the generation of the token as well in the Rails monolith part. So I did not skim through this entire MR, but I figured out it's a little bit different.
Jesse, seeing as you have some background on it, what's the suggested reviewers there is kind of described as being outside of the
Yes.
GitLab, the Rails monolith. What is it, a completely standalone web app, or I'm not I'm familiar with the suggested reviewers kind of top right hand side sidebar functionality, but I didn't know that it lived somewhere else.
Honestly, neither do I. I think this is a part of the GitLab, like, no, this is reviewer, right? Not even code.
It's, I think this is the suggested reviewers AI feature. So I think that piece is outside of.
I mean, the fact that the MR is inside, yeah, maybe if we look at the changes, but
I think that the endpoint to generate the JWT is in the Rails monolith, is my memory.
So I hope that
There.
what we've got here should be sufficient for us to kind of borrow.
Right. And
Yes, that
which class is this? Suggested reviewers. Yeah, this is the one, right?
Yes, this is the one.
So I did check this out. So essentially it just creates the payload for the token, access levels and everything, and the create service. And where is it? So it's creating a personal access token. It looks like.
But does that? I'm just wondering if does a JWT maybe always have a personal access token embedded in it, or?
Yeah, this is where my knowledge of entire authentication drops down like a bag of cards.
Yeah, I believe the shoot, I'm gonna mess this up if I try to draw from off my head. I do not believe that a JWT always has to have a personal access token associated with it. I also just realized that I was thinking of a slightly different MR from the same author, interestingly enough. This person loves JWTs. JWT. So I can try to dig that up. The one I was looking for was for code suggestions, not suggested reviewers. They're both AI features, so they're using these external services. And I can update you all. I mean, one question I had is, have you considered? No, this wouldn't work. I was going to say, have you considered using OAuth as a flow, but you can't use an OAuth token to do a Git push.
You can, and this is where you can. So, okay, we'll have to take a detour a little bit. Over here, what happens is before the workspace gets started, right? Now this will be a little bit of Kubernetes, but let me just show you what it will be. And okay, so this is Kubernetes, but essentially there's something called as an init container. That container basically will run before anything else, right? And we have to clone the project as part of the init container itself. And the reason for that is we cannot have the workspace ready, like the URL is ready, and the user opens it up, and then in the background, the project is getting cloned, right? Because for a big repository like GitLab, that will probably take 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That significantly impacts the user experience. So what we do is the cloning has to be done first, only then will we mark the workspace ready, which means the token available for it has to be, the token has to be available. For OAuth to happen, the user has to do some flow, and that token needs to be injected over here, right? If we were to not do this as init container and just do the other way around, which I just said, that could have been possible because I would click this URL over here. This essentially does an OAuth, by the way, because I'm already authenticated. It's not showing you. It does that OAuth, but we are not storing those tokens anywhere over here right now. So one of our ideas was we'll use a PAT for cloning and then the OAuth for other operations. But then I was thinking, if a JWT is possible, right? Why can't I just use a JWT for everything, right? Because the JWT can be, the provisioning of the JWT can be controlled from the Rails side completely. Whereas if I were to do a PAT plus an OAuth, right? I would need some component inside my Kubernetes cluster, which is this GitLab Workspaces proxy, which is doing that authentication to store those secrets into the Kubernetes secrets. And customers are not really happy when some component has access to Kubernetes secrets. They get really touchy about it. So I was just trying to avoid that eventuality. Does that make sense? I know I went around quite a few things over here, but trust me, that's the easiest way I could explain.
Yeah. No, that's good. you're giving us. This is like a good insight into something that I have not known very much about before today. So it's increasing my knowledge of remote development by like 100x.
So what I was
So-
trying to do up till now, right? Sorry,
Yeah.
I cut you off.
No,
Sorry.
no, you go.
I was essentially trying to play around with this particular thing. Essentially, Jagos was mentioning that an OIDC token is essentially a GitLab JWT token, which has some those are all the required fields set. And I was just trying to play around with that in the Rails console, but I did not get it working. So maybe, do you think if it would be a good idea to, and I know there's another issue that we have, so maybe we'll time box this to maybe next 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And
Mine is not, I added that, or if it's just mine, I just added that as like an option, but I feel fine moving forward with just this.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting problem. And you could potentially go back to the Rails console and show us kind of what you were digging with, or if you wanted to build something into code, you could. But Rails console is quick, isn't it? Right, a lot quicker than keep recompiling.
Now, bear with my almost childish knowledge of Rails over here.
So what I was trying to, I shared a blog post there, although I haven't really been able to multitask and read it to fully understand if it's relevant. But I'm interested to know which, do any of our API endpoints currently support JWT authentication? Like what do we have? I think we already have a mechanism to generate a JWT to authenticate with GitLab. But what can that JWT actually be used for? I don't really know. So, I think this is kind of similar to your approach, and hopefully everyone's, you look for somewhere else in the code that we already do something along these lines, and you go from there. So if anyone knows anything that we can already do using a JWT, I know there's something to do with CI and hence that blog post as well, but it's probably more for maybe CI to access other systems using their JWTs maybe rather than ours. But
yep, this is what I was trying to do, right? And here we are. So I was just basically doing a general search about JWTs in the entire code base, and I did find, which one was this? There are multiple things, to be honest. Some of them make sense, some of them don't. None of them make complete sense to me. I figured out there's a inbuilt class called JWT, and you need to pass in the payload. Okay, the payload looks like JTI is just a random UID so that replay attacks cannot happen. Who is the issuer? In this case, this will be gdk.test. When it was issued at, what is the expiry, and the subject, on whom do we want to issue this token, who it is related to, right? So I set that as payload, and eventually I want to set the access level as well, that this token will only be valid for maybe write a repository or something like that. I create some secret. What I realized is you need a SSL key for signing the secret. I was not aware of that. I thought a generic random secret would be available, but it looks like that's not the case. So if I think this was the one. No, not this one. Maybe this one. No. Wait a second.
So the one you were maybe talking about, Jesse, there, the code suggestions JWT.
Yeah, this is the class. And this is what I figured out from looking at the code. Okay, I need to pass these things. But after a point, I just lost a few things. Like, it's just throwing me errors like the secret has to be what do you say, an RSA instance, I was under the assumption that that is not a requirement, at least for JWT. You can sign from any secret, but I might be wrong.
Um, I think the issue is that we're using, there's like a well-known OpenID configuration endpoint. I'm gonna put it in the chat. And that is for, our existing OpenID Connect integrations. And so when this new JWT behavior was built, they kind of piggybacked on top of our existing OIDC logic, and they were like, okay, we'll just use like the signing key that we already have, or the JWK that we already have. So I believe that is why that is in that way.
Is this that key that you're talking about? This is this is just a 32-bit random key.
Okay.
Yeah. Because this is the same key that we are using for encrypting our secrets when we store it into the database under encrypted. So again, that's what I thought. So I just generated a random one. But yeah, I become a helpless person after this point.
So, I mean, one thing that I will say is if you wanted, so like the route you're taking right now is like you're hand rolling a JWT, right? Like you're not really hand rolling it because you're using an existing library in our code base, but you're looking at the code and saying, oh, we have this library that makes it possible to make a JWT. Let me see if I can create one, which might be the route you end up going. That is the route that they went for code suggestions because they didn't want to use OAuth. There was a very specific reason they couldn't use OAuth in that scenario. I can't even remember what it is at this point. If you did want to piggyback on OAuth, this would be a lot easier because we already have the ability for GitLab to be an OIDC provider. So somebody goes through the OAuth flow, but you get back a JWT with that flow, and that JWT includes the information that you want.
I'm more than happy. I think if that's possible, easier to do, that's not a problem by any means.
Yes, that should be easier. What I was just trying to find is there was, like, I had a crash course in OIDC some months ago because there was an OIDC related incident when we updated one of the gems. And so I was like, like, what even is OIDC at GitLab? And like, how do I, investigate what's broken here? And so I do somewhere have like very beginner friendly instructions because I wrote them for myself on how to set up OIDC plus OAuth at GitLab. I hope that I put that in the documentation somewhere, but I might not have. So anyways, I don't want to spend too much time digging for that, but I can help you with that after this.
That would be perfect.
I think what we could do, if you wanted to just figure this out in real time together, is we could follow the documentation for GitLab as an OpenID Connect provider and try to set it up either with your GDK or with just, gitlab.com or staging.gitlab.com and play around with it that way.
I already have an OIDC set up because over here, right? This is the one you're talking about. So yeah, the reason why we have it set it up is because, like I was mentioning, right, when the traffic comes to GitLab Workspaces proxy, it will first authenticate and authorize with GitLab whether it's valid or not. So it does an OAuth redirect to GitLab. And so what we do is when setting up remote development, we first create an OAuth application and the client ID and the client secret is passed to GitLab Workspaces proxy and it does that OAuth redirect. So we have already have a existing application set up. We can probably use that.
Yeah, I think, we'll have to see if you can, I can't remember which attribute you have to set in order for an OAuth app to request. I think there might just be like a specific scope you need. Oh, I think it's profile. Yeah, it's already profile. You already have that in OpenID. Okay, so when you get back the response from that flow, I think you should be able to pull out the JWT.
But the response would be over here, right? Because this is initiating the redirect. So essentially, you're suggesting from the code base itself, do a redirect over there. That's what you're suggesting, right?
Can you rephrase them? So you're saying in GitLab Workspace's proxy, you would have the OAuth Access Token in JWT, but you need it somewhere else?
I need it in the Rails part. The reason why I can't have it over here is because it's firstly for traffic to reach over here, the user has to browse the URL of the workspace. For the URL to be available to the user, the workspace needs to be running in a running state. For it to be in a running state, the project needs to be cloned. For the project needs to be cloned, we need a token.
So you have to start with the token.
Yes.
That's the
So if
precondition.
so maybe in the Rails code base itself, I do a redirect and get the token from there. Like as part of my code base, right? Let me show you what I mean by that. Over here, I am creating a personal access token, right? I'm thinking, should I just do a OAuth redirect and try to fetch a token over here instead of creating a personal access token? That should work, right? Technically.
Makes sense.
But wouldn't the user have to, can I be, because the complication, like if GitLab is the issuing authority, I think we can still work around with it, because otherwise user needs to explicitly authorize, okay, they can have the token, right? But if someone else is the issuing authority, let's say GitHub or Google, then I don't think that would be that, like, how do I authorize on behalf of the user itself if I were to do it in the code? Again, I'm not 100% clear, so maybe some of these questions are not framed correctly.
No, I think you are being clear. I'm just pausing because I'm thinking about how we would do that. I mean, we have access to all of the OAuth library code in the Rails. Like we are the identity provider in GitLab
Right.
Rails, and we have all of the OAuth code. So I can't think of a reason why we couldn't just generate the token within GitLab Rails and like give it to ourselves, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. We're the ones that have added this, what we're going to call it, like wall or protection or a kind of process that involves kind of redirecting and authenticating. But yeah, it seems like we should be able to kind of just skip that step and go directly to the bit that we need.
And I'm guessing that one thing that's probably been confusing as you've looked at this is that not all of our OAuth code lives in our code base. We depend on a lot of external libraries for our authorization and authentication code. And I find that really confusing, and I work on it every day. I'm sure it's really confusing if you don't work it any day, even more. So like what needs to be invoked exactly to create an auth access token? Like we can do that. It's just a matter of figuring out which library is doing it and like how they do it and then calling it.
And I'm looking at it from someone who's mainly working in Go, right? I'm like, what is this? What's going on? I have no idea, right? I can only understand the syntax to a certain extent. After that, I'm like, okay, I need to do some more research about this. Okay, how do we want to proceed over here? Should we then drop that OAuth idea and just dig into the trenches of just issuing the token directly? Or
I think so. I mean, I think based on the limitation you were just discussing, I don't think the OAuth path would work because we're not sending a request over to Kubernetes, or the OAuth access token needs to be in GitLab Rails and they request it. I guess one question I have is, how do we know that we trust the user? Like, how do we know which user is making the request to trust them?
So each user has a one-to-one mapping with. I mean, each workspace has a one-to-one mapping with a user. So there's a one-to-one mapping between a workspace and a user. One-to-one mapping between the workspace and the project from which that workspace was created. This might change in the future, but we have a one-to-one mapping over there. So if you were to access this URL right now, if someone were to access this URL, they will not be able to get it, because what happens is when you access this URL, it goes from here to the load balancer, it reaches Kubernetes, from the ingress controller, it reaches GitLab workspace proxy, it will do a OAuth redirect, it will get back, okay, it will authenticate you, and as part of authorization, it will check, does this user has access to this particular workspace? It gets the name of this workspace from the URL of the workspace itself. If you look at the URL, this is the name of the workspace itself. So it will do that authorization check and it will fail over there. So you will not be able to access it. So if any traffic that is coming from this instance will be from the user itself, as from the authenticated user, because for me to access it, I'm first authenticated and authorized. That is from within the workspace. From outside the workspace, there's no user interaction. Like when we are doing that project cloning, right? That happens even before the workspace gets started. So that's more like a service account kind of thing. Like there's no user interaction at all over there. Does that answer your question? I feel like
Yeah, no, I think that's you're doing great. You're doing great. You're doing great. No,
because we are a difficult time trying to explain what remote development is when we are trying to merge it. We were like we were those people who were like building this conspiracy theory. We are connecting 10 dots, and you know. So yeah.
I think it's good. You know, I was actually just talking to a friend of mine who is an engineering manager at GitHub, and you may already know this because you're deep in this world, but she told me that GitHub, you can only do remote development. So engineers at GitHub cannot do local development anymore. This has been true for several years now. Remote development is their only means of working on their own code base.
That's how they actually dog fooded it. Like they created it and they burned billions of dollars to actually make it what it is, the code spaces right now. And we just starting off to compete with them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Well, I think that interestingly, one of my KRs this quarter is about trying to start, I don't know what the word is, monitoring GDK, so we can see how stable, how reliable, etc. is, because we know that we have issues with GDK, and a lot of them are based on everyone having a very, very subtly different development environment. You know, I'm on Linux, you're on Mac, you're on 15.1, you're on 15.3. You've got RVM installed, you've got ASDF installed, etc., etc. So Raymond on my team has been working tirelessly on getting GDK working in remote development workspaces. So you may have already had conversations with Raymond, and he's making great progress. We've got customers who have got hugely locked down environments that can't contribute back to GitLab because they can't do a clone, for example, from GitLab.com. And again, we can unblock them by being able to provide them remote development workspaces, etc. So it does solve a lot of problems, other than the fact that we'll have a hell of a lot of processing power on our desks that's going unused. But you know, yeah, well, that's another thing. You know, we've got contributors with 8 gig of RAM that are unable to spin up the GDK, etc. So you know, it's very exciting what the possibilities are.
Yep, exactly the problem we're trying to solve, which is different development environments affecting people. We have one more customer who's trying to contribute to remote development since the day we started in January, but they are still trying to get their GDK working, believe it or not. After a point, I just gave up on it, and I was like, okay, they are not going to get any contributions from them.
wow, that's pretty disheartening.
But like I say, when you consider the fact that they can't even, whether it's the same one or not that we're talking about, they can't even do a clone from GitLab.com, you can start to understand some of the challenges.
this is, yeah, exactly. So I think this is coming back to this entire JWT thing, right? From this blog, and I was even looking at it yesterday. This is the class that they are using to the CI JWT 2 tokens, version 2. And if I look at this, I think this is using the identities that we are talking about, right? Like, because we are ourselves issuing authorities within the wall, they're probably using this. Can we try this one out? The only catch over here is the subject over here is it is linked to scope to a particular project and that particular job, but I want it to be scope to that particular user. I obviously have the user ID.
Yeah, I don't think that's a problem. It also looks like maybe, I think you were just putting the user ID before.
Yep.
Whether this kind of hints at maybe it should be prefixed in such a way that we know that it's a user ID, but it's probably not overly important at the moment. But
only if I had a step-by-step guide of how to do this.
Well, it sounds like you just volunteered to create one. So.
Okay. What should we do now? Should we? I feel like I've rambled about this for the last 45 minutes.
It's really interesting, and I think what you're probably envisioning at the moment, and I probably agree, is that it's going to take you a while to do some poking to make a bit of progress, but it might be something that you're in a position for us to revisit in, a few days or a week or something when you've made a bit of progress. But again, maybe you've hit a bit of a wall and you fancy a bit more pairing.
Yep. All right. At least I have a path forward. Like, I'll try to, like what Jesse mentioned within, and you mentioned, like within the wall itself, can we use the issuing classes to issue a OIDC token itself, but without going through that entire OAuth flow. Thanks for bearing with my incomprehensible rantings.
Thanks for sharing it. It's, as I say, really interesting. I'm sure we all learned a lot.
Yeah. And I'll take it as my homework to follow up with you on sharing the OIDC setup. I think the one I set up was a little different, but I think it was for GitLab as an identity provider using OIDC, and I was very explicit in my instructions to myself on how to decode the JWT, so hopefully I can help you with that after this.
I have a really easy one, actually, that I'd love to. I'm hoping someone around the table will actually know the answer without even having to run any code, etc.
Okay.
I dropped
in
in
screen share. Or
I won't yet. If I need to in a minute, I will. I have far too much stuff opened. But I shared. Yeah, if you don't mind. I popped the MR in here. So if you go to the overview, you'll have to find the relevant discussion. But there's one, probably one of the unresolved ones, talking about this one here, I think it is. So we've got a test which is essentially comparing like a webhook payload to the actual data, if that makes sense. And can you see here that it's failing because the customer relations contacts created at is like, I don't know what they are, nanoseconds, microseconds different from each other. So the way that we got around that, I say we, I was helping someone on my old team put this together, initially was to hard code the date as just a date without a time. That obviously gets rid of the time portion and means that there's no potential for any kind of discrepancy.
Sorry, was this was the suggestion you applied? Or?
Well, the opposite. So we had it working, but the reviewer and maintainer weren't overly happy with the hard-coded date. So
Yeah.
they said, why have you got that? You shouldn't need that, remove it. And weirdly, it worked when they ran the test in their environment, but it didn't work in our environment and it didn't work in CI. So we've now come up with another solution if you want to check the changes tab. But what I'd love to know is sort of if anyone else has experienced this and if the assumption that we came up with. So the solution we came up with was there a minute ago to on line 57. Now we are doing a contact.reload, and that fixed it. So here's my completely bonkers theory that's probably wildly inaccurate, but my belief was maybe that the precision in memory of a timestamp is different to the precision in the database of a timestamp, and therefore if we don't do the .reload, we're using the in-memory timestamp to compare to. If we do the reload, we're actually reloading the record that's been persisted to the database, and we've got the same timestamp. But tell me, has anyone experienced this problem before? Is that the reason? Is there a better solution? I know there's this like you can freeze time potentially, but
that was going to be my comment.
Do you think that that's a better solution? Like,
I usually find flakiness in tests all the time. Freezing it is usually the best way to go. Yeah.
Okay.
This definitely rings a really, really distant bell for me, this issue that you're talking about. And I think I've encountered it years ago. And I think what it is that if I remember correctly, and this may not be true anymore, but the timestamp for any of those like created at type fields, it's stored with the same precision on the model, but it's stored at the Ruby time that the save is made on the model. So it doesn't, when it does the create in the database, it doesn't reload, then respond with whatever the database said for the created time. It's just what was the time at runtime in Rubyland when I said save. So I think that's probably what you're seeing there.
So almost like your model has a created and updated timestamp, but the database actually ignores what you pass in and just uses whatever the current date.
Yeah, I think usually that's default now, I believe.
Gotcha.
On the
Gotcha.
So I think the model probably doesn't send the time, but it kind of like to short circuit having to reload the whole model again. It just says, oh, I'm just going to say that it's now, and then when you reload again, it will be a few milliseconds different because the database and the user space.
That makes more sense than my theory about the precision being different, which I couldn't back up.
Yeah.
The only thing that would be interesting to understand here is in this test, and maybe you could actually open up the test, the spec itself, that issue builder. I think it's this one I think is fine, which again we might ask the question, why is that fine? It's the issue builder spec that was causing the problem.
I'm not seeing any other specs in the diff right now.
Yeah, that one.
This one. Okay. Oh, this is what we're looking at. Okay.
Yeah. So if you see there's an expect for labels. So what I'm intrigued by is why is that not throwing the same, assuming that the label has a created and updated stamp. Maybe we could check that in the Rails console or something quickly just to have a look. But yeah, I was perplexed why we were having that problem with the contact record, but the label record not. So I was also looking at seeing why they're different. And the only thing that we could identify as being different was that the label is without time zone and the contact is with time zone. But yeah, I don't know.
Both hook adders. I guess I don't know where. Do we know where this is defined?
Yeah, I mean, it should be an issue mode, but you could just spin up a Rails console and do like issue.last.label hook attrers or something like that, and
Okay, let
Labels
me
do
s-
have created that and updated that. Yeah.
in the hook attrers.
Oh, that's a good question.
Okay, so
In
I'm trying to
general,
make
they
my
do, though. Yeah.
see if my Rails console wants to play nicely today. The other thing I was going to say, I just pulled up this issue. I've had this issue. Malcolm brought up Ruby versus database time. I've also had an issue where the CI database failed on a test because it was on a different Postgres version, and different Postgres versions like have different precision levels potentially. There's
Right,
something with
okay.
CI Postgres versus local Postgres, which could explain why maybe your machine has a different Postgres version from the reviewer's machine. That's an idea. This
Okay.
this recommends not using time freezing, but the be like time matcher, which is looking for less precision than equality. So that's another idea.
The challenge with that, you then have to explicitly match on each attribute, which then means, you know, it's not very dry. You know, if you add a new column to the model, then you've got to update the spec, etc. So
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you're just looking for the nested attributes. So I have an issue.
Tests don't have to be dry.
well, yeah, what it's more about is wanting to make sure that the test fails if somebody adds something without having to update the test, if that kind of makes sense. Issue.first I found had labels for me. I don't know whether you'll be so lucky.
Okay. So that
No,
I did last
no.
again. Oops.
Oh,
Okay. Mm,
You just grab the last label and get the hook attributes.
good idea. I so rarely. Oh, so
there we go.
the first issue has labeled hook adders, but it doesn't have customer relations contacts hook adders. So maybe that's why.
No, I think that we're specifically in our test, we're picking an issue that does have them, but this just confirms that we definitely have created and updated in our label hook attributes, which adds to my confusion as to why would that pass when we're comparing the label hook attributes to the label. So if you look back in the spec again, we're doing pretty much exactly the same.
Here. No. Here.
I think where you can only see your
Oh,
terminal.
sorry.
Yeah.
It's all right. It's all right.
Okay, here we go. This one, are we in the right one? You see this?
Yes, so you can see like line 56 and 57 are pretty much identical. And if you look at how we create the labels and how we create the contacts, again, we're just using a let it be. So that's what I was really struggling with, you know, to see, well, what's different, and the only difference I can find is one stored in the database with time zone and one's without. So I don't know whether it's.
I'm trying to create a contact just to see what it looks like.
Yeah, awesome.
Create. Oh, hold on. Issue.first.project.
There might actually be a precision difference. Just reading between what Rails sends and what Postgres stores. I'm just reading a blog post here.
Okay.
That says when Rails models are saved to the database, any timestamps they have stored using a type in Postgres called timestamp without time zone has a microsecond resolution, i.e. 6 digits after the decimal place.
Yeah.
So when you send a 7-digit after the decimal place timestamp, which I think on some platforms, but not all. So I think there's a difference on Mac OS and Linux.
Yeah, so we were running it on Linux, and I guess CI's run on Linux, but almost certainly the reviewer or maintainer would have probably been on Mac OS. So that's interesting.
So they've run a test here where they say 70% of the timestamps on Linux had 7 digits of precision. So even that wasn't
right.
It was slightly random. Those
We're losing you a bit now.
Oh yeah, I don't know if that was me. I think Malcolm cut out a bit.
Your
There you are. Oh.
Too much training data being submitted to the AI from
our
community.
I've heard, but it's on
Oh, you're still doing this with your voice.
And when they're on Mac,
Do one more test. See if we can hear you. I think you're done.
let me send the blog
better.
post.
Oh, you're back. You're back.
I stopped your camera, and
Oh, no.
that might have improved the audio without video.
I think you probably have to come here and rewire my internet to improve it.
Yes, this is the issue.
Did it say anything on this article, as I'm skimming it, that there's a difference when you set it like with time zone and without time zone? Or
Oh, because you're wondering why the two attributes aren't having issues the same way.
Yeah, exactly.
Long story short,
oh man,
we're still losing you. We get like one interesting word and then it's nothing. It's a bummer. It's a bummer.
I'm wondering if the time zone is takes up part of the precision. Maybe that's why. If you know what I mean. So if you imagine that the field size is the same for with and without time zone, but one has to store the time zone and one doesn't, then that might be enough to push it over the edge.
Yeah, and you can't see this fail locally, so you can't look at it and see that why it's failing.
Well, it won't for me. It does in Gitpod, which is where the guy on my old team's sort of been working.
I see.
And in CI it fails as well. But the problem is I don't know that we would be able to dive that deep under the hood anyway and really see what's happening. I mean, maybe you can, but do you know what I mean? To see what's happening between the model and the database, like that's active record magic there, right? So
yeah, but you could get the output of the failure, or like have them put out what they expect and what they're getting, and just see.
Well, that's already on the MR anyway. So okay. That's what we were looking at a minute ago, where we could see that it's a few microseconds.
Oh, I missed that. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll look at that. It sounds like you have volunteered to update our docs on time zones and tests. So I look forward to your contributions.
No, that's awesome. Let me just make sure I didn't close the window with that link that Malcolm shared. Yeah, it's really just that bit about what's the difference between the labels and the contact. The only way I can think of figuring this out, which is a real pain in the backside, but would be to write a local migration to change the timestamp on the contacts from with time zone to without time zone, and see if that then fixes it. Because that's the only difference I can see between labels and contacts. The dates stored with time zone for one and without for the other.
Yeah, I will say that we should go. But my favorite way to solve this problem when I was less wise than I am now was just to make every time zone be dot beginning of hour, so that it's a nice round time.
Which was essentially our hard-coded dates without time solution, but sort of understandably it got flagged. I think if we had have struggled any further, I would have said, well, that's not a community contributor's problem. Like, let's get it merged, and then someone can follow up on that, because this is, you know, way above even my pay grade, let alone that. So, but it's interesting. Awesome. No, wicked. Thanks all for indulging me, and yeah, I'll feed back.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, both of you, for bringing fun issues to discuss. This was great.
Have a great day.
Thanks,
everyone.
folks. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.